First, has everybody seen Strange Days?
No.
Yo, go rent the shit. Netflix, you can download it for free. It's fucking brilliant. It's one of the best Afrofuturist dystopian science fictions I've ever seen. And the fucked up part is it was set in 2000. So, the movie is brilliant. This shit that I'm about to read, maybe not so much, but it will be interesting. I'll give you guys that. The main things to remember, it's not quite set on the flow of the movie, which you guys haven't seen, so no one will like send me like angry Facebook messages. It wasn't true, it's a fucking movie! It's just inspired by the trailer. So remember Angela Bassett, because she kicks ass, and remember the tapes. That's the two big important things there. And remember the opening dialogue of the movie, because that's kind of interesting. So, here we go. Have you ever jacked off? Have you ever fiddled your own wires? The soon-to-be famous, already an asshole entertainer, who no one at the dinner table particularly liked, leered around at the other guests with all the dirty satisfaction of a 10-year-old who just farted into a hot, crowded elevator. He caught the eye of the youngest daughter of the oldest woman at the table, whose cheeks were doing their best cherry tomato impression. He licked his glossy lips and revved up the next quip from his "Look at me, I'm shocking" dinner script, when all of a sudden the loud, low rumble, the purposeful clearing of a very important throat at the end of the table turned all the heads. And after the warning, the conversation shifted gears, clicked on its turn signal, and merged from the fast lane of racy talk back into the snarled and staid traffic jam of appropriate dinner conversation. Leaning back from the table, patting a big belly full of prime ribs, taxes, and promised tax endorsements, the President of the United States of the Americas swirled the dark snifter of whiskey in the most powerful right hand in the free world and looked around the table of extravagance. But despite what the dinner guests assumed from the president's downturned jowls, it wasn't that he was particularly offended by the sex talk, despite the fact that unlicensed sex of any kind had been banned for years. The men and women at the table, and the unwanted asshole entertainer, were, after all, the most powerful people in the country. They were in fact the ones that made the mandate requiring the 5-year evaluation period, the stacks of paperwork and seal of approval from the Ministry of Non-Essential Permitting. In addition to giving extracurricular activities, given the extracurricular activities of most of the people in attendance, there was no dinner party in the world that was more equipped to talk about fucking people. In every sense of the word. And after all, it was New Year's Eve 2043. And there were plenty of reasons to celebrate with a little dirty talk. The new society had effectively taken over the government, the media, the utilities, the transportation industries, and there was no reason to believe that the new United States of the Americas would not continue its role as leaders of the free world. What insulted the president was the dual combination of offenses that the unrefined twat was committing. Incompetence and the loathsome ability to mask that incompetence with charisma. The president had no doubt the man would become a politician. But he was snapped from this premeditation as he heard that his title being spoken with more formality than he was desiring on this night off. Mr. President, the voice spoke lowly but with urgency from the crisp black suit standing beside him. Sir, you have a situation. And so it was that 30 seconds after stepping into the formal dining hall to deliver the message, the special aide to the head of the Central Intelligence Agency was leaving the high-ceilinged room with the very wary president at his side. 45 seconds after the president realized that it was more than a small matter, the two men moved down the hall into the elevator to the underground floors of the bunker reserved for war briefings, sensitive political meetings, and the occasional extraterrestrial encounter which may or may not be imagined. 4 minutes after leaving his New Year's celebration, President James Earl Doover was watching his life explode, the rockets of dazzlers and alarm bells rattling around his head hours before the scheduled midnight revelry. Doover stood in the middle of a soundproof, surveillance-free safe room at the bottom of a compound and watched, along with the vice president, the head of the CIA, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as the video streamed on the wall in front of them. It showed the portly president on his knees, naked, bent over, and bound. And although a blindfold covered a portion of his face, there was no mistaking Duber's telltale jowls, just as there was no mistaking the long black dildo sliding between his greasy cheeks as he moaned and asked for more, mommy, please, please just give me a little bit more. In a normal situation, if anything about this situation would have ever qualified as normal, the vice president, the head of the CIA, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would have at least registered a modicum of shock before beginning their government-appointed duties of discovering the who, the whats, and the what the fucks of this situation before making it quietly disappear. But their collective indignation never came because, unfortunately, they knew exactly the who's, the whats, and the what the fucks of this situation. As the vice president, the head of the CIA, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, along with their wives, lovers, and several other prominent members of the new society, were all in the room when this high-end bacchanal was occurring. A topic that would make for a very disturbing breakfast conversation if this tape had ever been released. They all watched as the scene switched around the room, the video showing each of their faces clearly as they moaned and ground themselves into various states of officially prohibited ecstasy. The vice president, tied to the bed and being covered in what appeared to be a smooth grape jelly. The head of the CIA bound to a table while a large woman rode his face like a saddle. The president's wife being held up and penetrated by two very large, very well-endowed black men. The president of the United States of the America, bent over a wooden bench and ass-fucked mercilessly. The sound on the video was low, and the woman's voice cracked through the air like a whip, slapping an ass cheek. Gentlemen, I'm assuming we don't need much of a description of what's going on here now, do we? Who is this? Where'd you get the tape? Duber's thick face was red as baboon ass as he barked at the unseen voice. On the other end of the line, Angela sat in a high-back captain's chair as she looked at the wall of monitors in front of her. Her dark fingers filed the nails on each hand as she watched the wall of screens. One row showed the president's soundproof surveillance-free safe room, several angles catching each of the men as they shifted and they sweat. Several more cameras showed raw footage of the various sex tapes she'd spliced together to make the final scene. Other cameras showed scenes collected from the network of lo-fi distribution networks she'd collected over the last few years. Never mind where I got the tape. Just know that I have it. And from here on, Mr. President, you can address me as goddess. Angela's voice dripped over the line like arsenic laced honey. But even she had to smile at the presumptuous alias. But if President James Earl Duber could rig the first election after the Great Quake and claim himself President of the United States of the Americas for life, then fuck it. She wanted to be called goddess. What are you going to do with the tape? Do you know what it will do to the fabric of society if this tape gets out? Imagine the world opening up and swallowing us all. Nah, Angela thought. Just swallowing up all the conservative old hypocritical fucks like you. Doobie, please. Ain't nobody gonna freak out because you sucked a little dick. If the world ends over a couple of lazy sucks, then we might just be needing a new world, don't you agree? I mean, from the looks of it, your blowjob game ain't nothing to talk about anyway. I mean, it's more like high school treasurer than president of the free world. But what do I know? Sex has been outlawed for most of my life anyway. You can't release the tape. There'll be an all-out war and you know it. The president's voice sounded desperate. And he was sweating. Sweating like he'd been that same evening when the tall women had suspended him and flogged him during the offending orgy. He was beginning to feel a similar terror of crucifixion, but without the promise of sweet release from the previous encounter. Well, maybe it's time for a war. Angela twisted a thick dreadlock as she crossed her legs and surveyed the screens. The stories pumped from the official sources in the new society were much different from the feed she'd acquired over the years with her army of activists. The truth of most people's lives beyond the gates, from the imposed restrictions to the curfews to the beatings to the lies to the legislation designed to cover it all up, was much more dystopian than anyone would be willing to talk about publicly. That's why Angela knew that this tape of the president and the leaders of the country getting rode like horses and twisted around each other in sweaty ecstasy was just the shot in the arm that the country needed. While you were starving, they were gorging themselves. While they fuck you with legislation, they're getting fucked with big rubber cocks. This is where your tax dollars are going. And when she released the second round of tapes later in the week, showing in detail the brutality and poverty of all the people that were facing it around the country, Angela had no doubt that this would be the final outrage to rouse people into collective action. This tape is a lightning bolt from God, she tells the president, as she loads the recording and prepares to broadcast the stream. It can change things that need changing before we all go off the end of the road. So as it was over the course of the next 12 hours, as people turned to their state-sponsored news feeds and found them overrun with presidential cocks and balls, Angela smiled, and the president's sweat poured harder as they both imagined all across the country. As the video rolled, wet spots were forming in panties and pants strained against unsanctioned erections, as nipples, clits, and cocks rose, swollen with blood and heat. The tiny appendages standing stiff and striking out into the air, like fists raised in revolution.